Pivot Tables, Just the Basics by Dennis Smith. We're going to take a look today at how we can create pivot tables in Microsoft Excel. Pivot tables are a way to do real easy interactive reporting to summarize data that you have in Microsoft Excel spreadsheets. It's real simple and intuitive. If you know your data, all you need to do is be able to click and drag and drop things, and you can create pivot table reports. And that's what we're going to learn how to do today. Again, if you can drag things, click on things, drag things, drop things, you can create pivot tables. The only other thing that you need to know is when to click and where to drag things, and that's what we'll look at and learn today. Very simple, straightforward, easy way to do reporting in Microsoft Excel. So the first thing you need is some data. A lot of businesses, a lot of individuals now have data that they store in Microsoft Excel spreadsheets, just lists of information. If you have some data you want to report on and it's not in Excel, most databases now will let you write Excel tables, and that includes things like your checkbook programs, your online bank accounts, genealogy programs, almost anything that allows you to work with data has an option to write it out into an Excel table, and then you can use pivot tables to do very easy reporting on them. So I'm going to use a set of data today that's a list of names of salespeople and their sales for both broadcast and print sales, and look at some of the ways that we can organize and report on that. The first thing you do is open your table and click somewhere in the data that you want to do a report on. Then we're going to go to the Insert tab, the Tables group, and the Pivot Table button. And the commands that I use today, I'll give all in that format. First will be the tab, which are across the top of the ribbon, and then the group, which run across the bottom of the ribbon, and then the button or menu within the group. So my first command is Insert tab, Tables group, Pivot Table menu, Pivot Table button, which brings up the Create Pivot Table dialog box. Now this dialog box tells you the range that Excel guessed that you wanted to create a pivot table from. And in this case it's A4 through H17, and it also put a scrolling marquee around there so you can see what data Excel thinks you want to use. The way that it determined that, the way it made that guess, was it looked for blank rows and blank columns to determine the extents of your data. Works great. However, if you have a blank row or a blank column, it'll make an incorrect guess and only get some subset of your data. And if that happens, the reason it stops here is so you can highlight the correct data. So for instance, if I wanted to include those two empty columns in my data, I could just highlight it. Now the range is A4 through J16, and it would include those columns. That's not what I want to do. I really want to use A4 through H17, so I'm going to re-highlight. Now we have what we did originally, but we got the option to change it here. And you tell it where you want the pivot table report to go. You could go in your existing worksheet with your data. Should never do that. Get that into a new worksheet where you're not making changes in your original data. You don't want to take a chance on accidentally changing something or moving something around in your data. Just stay out of it if you can. Put it in a new worksheet. Say OK. We now have our data in a new sheet, or our pivot table report in a new sheet. Our data is still in the original sheet, but we don't have to work there. We can work in the new sheet that was added with the pivot table report. And we have a pivot table report. It has a placeholder there right now because we haven't told it what fields to use. While the report is selected, we'll see contextual tabs for the pivot table, the pivot table tools options, and pivot table tools design. These tabs allow you, for instance, in the option tab, to change optionally some of the things that we see in our table, some of the things that affect how it works. In design, we change basically what you see, so how things look. So we have those two sets of things that we can use, and we have a pivot table task pane that appears, and at the top of that is the field list. It's a list of all the fields that were in the data that we selected, with a little check box just to the left where we can check the fields that we want to use in our pivot table. If we click outside the report, both the contextual tabs and the task pane go away. Click back in your report and those reappear. To start our report, we need to select some fields. As soon as we select the first field, we'll have an actual report and the placeholder will go away. I'm going to select last name. And now I have a pivot table report. Real simple, but I have one. I'm going to select region. I'm going to select broadcast sales. Now when I selected last name and region, they contain text data, so they went in as row labels. Over here, they're row labels in our report. When I selected broadcast sales, it has values, so it went into the values section. So we now have a simple report showing our salespeople's last names and then their position and the broadcast sales that they've made. The order that I selected fields in made a difference in how the report is organized. For instance, if I had selected region before last name and then last name, our row labels would be organized first by region and then by last name and subtotaled out when we selected the broadcast sales. That layout makes more sense for the data that we have right now, but I want it to be the other way before we continue, so I'm going to go back and select the last name and then region. But you can see we're changing the report just by what we do in the task pane over here. Now what might make sense for this report is we might want to see our broadcast sales subtotaled by region here in the columns. And to do that, we just grab a region, drag it over to a column, and let go. And when we did that, the data pivots, region comes over here to the columns. That's how you pivot the table. That's where it gets its name. Dragging your fields back and forth between column and row labels pivots the table, changes where they display. So now we've got a nice little pivot table, shows things broken down by region and totaled out by salesperson and subtotaled here by region and then totaled out overall. And you can see that we're getting some large numbers. This one's 3,870,000. It might make sense to reformat this and show some commas in the numbers, and we're going to do that now. So the way that we'll do that, all these numbers come from broadcast sales. That's the only thing we have to format. We'll come over under values to sum of broadcast sales. Click on the little arrow here and select value field settings. Now under value field settings, for sum of broadcast sales, I could change the calculation. If I didn't want to use sum, I could have a count, an average, a maximum or a minimum. Standard deviation, variance are down there as well. I'm going to leave it at sum. That's the one you use most often. I'm going to go to number format. Here I could make it currency, use an accounting format, or format it as date and time, but I want to use just a general number formatting. So we're in our Format Cells dialog box. We've selected a number format. We'll tell it we want to use comma separators, and we want to have no decimal places. So we'll crank those down to 0. You can see here in the negative numbers kind of how the numbers are going to look, and we could select a different negative number format here. The one I just selected would make it red in parentheses, but we want to use the standard negative number format with a minus, so we'll select that again. And we'll say OK in Format Cells and OK in Value Field Settings, and there are numbers formatted just like we selected the number formatting for. So that's some basic formatting. With what we've done right here, if I quit if we quit right now, you could create a basic spreadsheet, a basic pivot table report from your data without going any farther with anything, just on how you can drag things around. So you could go back to your office, open up a pivot table, open up a spreadsheet, and create a nice pivot table report from it. What we're going to do is continue to elaborate a little bit more on this. Suppose you wanted to add some fields or remove some fields. You just remove check marks to remove one. So there I've taken region out. Put region back in, I can just click on it. Now since I put a check mark there, it came in as row labels because it has text data, and I would have to move it back up to column to get the table back the way it was, the report back the way it was. Or I could grab region here and just drag it down to columns. That gives me the same report. Doesn't matter how I get it there, I can click on it, drag it up here from row labels, or I can just drag it in there in the first place. I get the very same report. So just click on the checks to put things in or remove things. Sometimes you might want to rename the sheet that this is in, and you just have to double click on it and give it a new name. That's really an Excel command, and I'm going to call this sales by position. Sales by position. Now you have to hit enter after you type a new name, or it may not stick. If you just click back in the sheet, it may go back to just having the same sheet and the sheet number. So we hit enter, and now we have it renamed sales by position. So we've got a nicely formatted little pivot table report here. What you might want to do next is look at just some subset of this data. For instance, we might want to filter it for sales under 150,000 or sales over 300,000. Look at our better salespeople. To do that, we click in row labels and go to the filters. Notice we could sort it here alphabetically, A to Z or Z to A. We could go to a label filter, so we could filter it based upon the label for last name. We could have last names that begin with a letter, like everyone whose last name began with M. All the Smiths, we could filter it for that. Or we can go down to this lower section and we can just filter it by the actual names of our salespeople. Take the check mark out of select all, and I can just pick people that I wanted in my report. So now my report would be filtered for Clayton, Hill, and Martinez, just those people. I want it to look at all of them though, and we're going to filter it by sales greater than or equal to broadcast sales greater than or equal to $300,000. So we'll put 300,000 in here and say OK. And there we filtered our table for sales greater than or equal to $300,000. Now when we applied the filter, a little filter appears here next to row labels, and it appears over here next to last name. So we can tell that this is a filtered report. So one other thing you might want to do is you may look at the data and decide that you need another number in the report that you can calculate from your existing number. So we could add a calculated field. We could go to the original data and just add a column, but then we'd be messing with our original data. We don't need to do that because we can stay right here in our report and add a calculated field. So let's add a field to calculate commissions. We won't need to see the region, so we'll take the region back out of there, and we want to add a field to calculate commissions. So we're going to go to Pivot Table Tools, Options, Tools Group, Formulas, and Calculated Field. Get the Calculated Field dialog box, and the first thing we want to do is name our new field. Name it commission, and then we want to enter our formula. Formulas have to begin with equals, so we'll leave the equals there. We're going to replace that 0 with our broadcast sales. So we'll click on broadcast sales and click insert field. That puts in broadcast sales. We could have just typed this. We would have had to remember to put the single quotes around it, and it had to be spelled exactly right and have a space, so it's easier to use the field list. And we want to multiply, so we'll put in an asterisk times 0.1. We're going to have commissions to be 10% of sales. So now that we've named our field, created our calculation, our formula to do the calculation, we can add that field. We could add an additional one now if we wanted to. Commission is now a field within this report, and we can use it in the report, and we can use it in other calculations as well. So we'll say OK. And here we have our sum of commissions. We can see it in our field list. We can see it down here in our values. I can turn it off, and it'll stay there. In this report, I can turn it back on. We can rearrange the order by dragging them here to change how it's ordered. It's just like any other field, except it does not exist in the original data. It's only there as a calculation when we run reports. So those are the basics of doing pivot tables, a nice, easy, interactive way to do reporting in Microsoft Excel. I want to thank you very much for your time today, and you have a good day.